Hey, very good evening, everybody, from Chennai Photo Biennale. It's been great to have all of you with us, many of you at least, over the last couple of weeks, where we've had wonderful tours with Biennale for Actual Photography from Germany. Today is our last tour with them, and it's been a fantastic journey. For those of you who are signing in today for the first time, to give you a quick introduction, Chennai Photo Biennale, the CPB, is a public arts photography organization. We teach workshops, have panel discussions, talks throughout the year. And at the end of every 2 years, we have a public art festival that happens in the city of Chennai every 2 years. We had the fantastic opportunity of visiting the Biennale for Actual Photography when they had opened as part of the Goethe Institute South Asian Photography Visitors Program. And we had a great time there, thanks to the team over there. Unfortunately now, because of the pandemic, the shows are closed down, but the shows are also available online. But we thought of collaborating and making you meet some of the artists and also some of the local art historians, curators, and directors of various museums. Today, we are going to take you through our last show, which is called When Images Collide. And I hand over to Yasmin, who is the managing director of the Biennale for Actual Photography, to start the tour for us.
Hi, everybody. I'm very happy to have you here. And also for the all the people who are here the first time, we record this session, and but neither the chat nor the people are joining are recorded, so don't worry. And we are very happy to make a little presentation of our Biennale für Aktuelle Fotografie. We have all in all 6 venues, and this year the Biennale is curated by David Company, the British curator, and he made a show which is called sorry, my daughter. The show is called The Lives and Loves of Images, and it's all about migration of images, how images become iconic, how they influence new images, and it's also about our affection towards photography and also how we are suspicious about them. So it explores these mixed feelings we have. And today we are in the Wilhelm-Hack-Museum in Ludwigshafen. And this show is called When Images Collide. And I'm very happy that René Zechlin, the director of the Wilhelm-Hack-Museum, is here. Hello, René.
Hello.
And our artist Sohrab Hura is also here, and we are very happy to have you and talk about your work. And now I would like to hand over to René, and I'm very curious what you all have to say about the exhibition. So have fun, everyone.
Yeah, hello, and from me as well. As Yasmin mentioned, you're looking into the Wilhelm-Hack-Museum here in Ludwigshafen in Germany, and we'll have a tour also through the other artworks of this show later on. But first of all, we would like to have a closer look and talk about the video work by Sohrab Hura, The Lost Head and the Bird, which is installed here in this space. And I'm wondering, maybe we can, I would first of all talk a little bit about the story before we look into the video. Is this okay with you, sir?
Yeah, please, go ahead.
Because I was, the interesting thing is it starts with a story written by you, and also with different metaphors, like losing one's head or borrowing an ear, which are a kind of linguistic metaphors, which you take for very serious and in a very direct way. How this idea came about to use this as a starting point?
I mean, in a practical way, I wrote a story because I was asked to actually accompany some of the images which were going to be published somewhere with words, and I didn't want to really tie the images to something very descriptive. I think I was also very aware that there were certain undercurrents that I wasn't really able to touch upon with images. Like, images are limited in their own ways. And I wanted to kind of open up a certain realm of absurdity through a story that I ended up concocting in a way, you know. So, I mean, the story does have, I mean, there was a person called Madhu who I'd met. So the story is kind of named after that person. But I wrote the work also at a time when, I mean, politically, there were certain shifts that were starting to happen in a very visible way. And, you know, every time we would hear some new news of lynchings or you know, certain events that were taking place, it just felt really absurd at that time. Today, you know, somehow the absurdity of it doesn't really pop up so much because it's become so frequent. But I wrote the work more at a time when these things were still a bit of a shock to all of us. And for me, you know, the story has different characters. I mean, it's got Madhu, the woman who kind of whose head has been stolen by an obsessive lover, and that's a man. And there's a fortune teller who's also a man, and the third character is the idiot photographer, which is me, also a man. But the idiot photographer is also, you know, all of you watching the work in some ways, the voyeurs, the people partaking in the violence in some ways, and using these characters, I think for me, I was trying to, in a way, fix certain points within a certain social realm, which I was kind of a social and political realm that I was trying to build. But I myself also needed to be part of it because I was also questioning my own role as an image maker. And I was also, when I started making the photographs at that time, I thought that the work was just about violence because that's what was, you know, full frontal at that time. So, you know, my photography itself, I felt was quite jarring and violent. And I was making photographs in an aggressive way. It was a certain vocabulary that I was choosing quite consciously. I mean, these also things about perception. How am I actually putting forward that idea of violence and imagery? And later on, obviously, the work wasn't just about violence anymore. It was more about power. It was about this notion of who tells the stories, you know. So, for example, today, just a few days ago, in a state called Maharashtra in India, you had lynchings that happened, and they were based on rumors. And a lot of the news channels, many of them that are kind of supporting the government, and they're getting support from the government. They immediately made it about, you know, Muslims being the ones who are the perpetrators. And it's only now that you know, it's turned out that there are no Muslims who are in the list of accused. But it's already being a bit late because the message has already gone out, you know. So, and then we had a home minister who was on record telling his party workers that doesn't matter whether it's real or not, make it go viral. So this idea of making something go viral, which kind of amplifies the narrative, these are things that have been building up for a while. So going back to the story, for me, these characters, in a way, anchor the photographs or the video in a sort of I think it gives you these social anchor points in some ways. And in the video, the story also keeps shifting because there are 12, the video work is in loop, which kind of keeps morphing into something else little by little. These are very small shifts that are taking place. And the story also in each sort of version keeps shifting, you know. So in the first story, you have Madhu, whose head has been stolen by her obsessive lover, and she keeps getting sold a parrot by the fortune teller she is dependent on, who keeps telling her, I mean, she keeps buying a crow thinking that it's a parrot because the fortune teller keeps telling her that it's a parrot with a bad cough, and you know, you have to keep giving it medication for it to kind of get better. And at the same time, you have this idiot photographer who wants to photograph this woman with a lost head, you know. So there's also this element of voyeurism in the photographer, this element of you know, something sensational. But towards the end, I mean, little by little, the words keep getting changed. So towards the end, you know, Madhu, her head has been borrowed by a lover whose heart had been broken by her. And she did go to the fortune teller, and the fortune teller had warned her, but she didn't really listen to him. And at the same time, the idiot photographer wants to get to know her story, not necessarily to photograph her. So, you know, there is a shift of empathy away from Madhu, the character who's obviously the one who's being wronged upon in the first story, you know. Whereas in the third one, in the 12th story, by that time, the blame is kind of shifted onto her. And I feel like even if you look at, for example, the Me Too movement, if someone kind of calls someone out to say that the person has been wronged by someone, little by little, the narrative kind of keeps getting tampered with, you know, like, what was she wearing? Why was she giving the signal? So there are these other elements that kind of come in and take away that agency and somehow change the empathy, you know, within the narrative that's existing amongst us. So those are the things that I've been trying with the story, because in the end, the work is more about in the work, I'm trying not to let any one sort of meaning settle, because very often I think that's also the burden of photography, where we have forever assumed that you know, a photograph reveals a definite meaning. But I think that's why I'm kind of juxtaposing, constantly changing the juxtapositions in all the images to try and trigger off different shifts within different pairings, you know. And some of these pairings have overlapping images, but those images kind of become different in each pairing. And this is something that I kind of borrowed from something that's been happening for a while, where you have old images that are dug up and new context is given to it, you know. The context is manipulated, so it's more about the context rather than the image. And I think in a way, with the story, I'm able to reveal the contextual part of, you know, the work more clearly than the imagery part. I hope that makes sense.
Can I quickly ask a question? I mean, we didn't see the whole video yet, and I can recommend everybody to see the whole video, which is almost 12 minutes. And Sohrab Hura, it was so nice to us to put it online, only for a short period of time, for the weekend, you said, right?
Yeah.
Thank you so much. And so you can see it on his website, and we will have a little glance on it, maybe right now, and go on talking about this, okay? That the people have an idea.
Yeah.
And maybe as an explanation, kind of like the story sort of was just talking about, is just the introduction of the entire video, which is only 3 minutes of 10 minutes in total. So then after this story, the video continues like this. Continue or can we continue a little bit, or shall we stop?
Yeah, I think, I mean, you can actually fast forward it so that people can see a later part of it if they, or you can stop. I mean, I'm okay with whatever. It's there on my website. People can see it.
Maybe, René, maybe you can quickly show Madhu, because there I have a question. Well, like the woman with the lost head, because you show it, Sohrab, and my question was if there was first the idea for the story, or if there was at first this image.
The image came first. I think I'm a visual person, and I think I have been writing more stories, but very often I kind of enter the stories through the images. You know, that kind of gives me a structure to weave something together. So, yeah. And I mean, this is something I've also, in the video, I've put in links where I've talked about it. As I was saying in the beginning, I didn't really imagine making it in this format. It was just photographs, and those photographs were more about reacting back to the world in an aggressive way, because I was feeling quite claustrophobic in what I was sensing around me. So I was also kind of trying to hit outwards. And then little by little, I was also started to play with these juxtapositions. And then the story happened because, you know, instead of being in a place where I was expected to write something, I didn't want to kind of anchor it in something which was too literal. I ended up writing a story that was living parallel to the work in some ways. Then I started kind of trying to work with the pacing of it, the whole thing about what happens also in terms of the reading of the images. You know, like how long do you have access to the image? What can you see? Because that also kind of changes the context. And then somewhere later on, I think by around 2014, it also has a lot to do with, I think, the parallels with the time when this current government came to power. My parents were quite new to social media, WhatsApp and so on. And they started getting a lot of forwards from friends, which they would kind of send to me. And I was at that time trying to explain to them that all of that was fake, but they didn't really understand, you know, because for them, they had been sent these forwards from friends. And there was also this thing of fact, you know, how do you verify fact? And for them, it was all about this element of trust, you know, from the source, which was just a friend who had also received a forward from somewhere else. So there's a big chain. And digging more into it, I realized that there's actually a new form of communication that had been already in place. You know, in a way, I think I also started to realize how limited I was as a photographer, because I think before, I think maybe perhaps till about early 2000s, we could have still considered this space that, you know, some of us who are here in this discussion right now, some of us exist in this more formal space of photography. And then we would look at something that was, you know, the colloquial form, you know, which could have been family albums or the hobby photographer, which in many ways was a much smaller world at that time. But somewhere around 2014, I had a reality check that actually our world, the so-called formal world, was quite insignificant. The real world of images was actually far bigger than us. You know, it was this that I was seeing, these people making images without agenda, but yet kind of circulating it in a pretty viral way. So maybe 50 years ago we had iconic images, and now I think we only have viral images. And I started getting more and more interested in that, because for me that's the real world of images. You know, with
ask one more question. Sorry, René. Can I mean, you say something about the floating of images, and that images are also don't really have a place, or when our communication is so digital and so on. So it's all around the world somehow. But you also gave this video and Madhu a place. I mean, she is in Chennai, right? So, and you are talking about a specific space, which I thought it was a nice, maybe coincident or not, because you are not living there. So I wondered,
no,
why did you...
I'm actually happy. I'm happy you talked about it, because that was something I'd wanted to come to. So in India, we also have a lot of, a set of regional politics, you know, and in a way, for example, I'm North Indian going to Tamil Nadu, which is why there's a hint even in the story where when the edit photographer is trying to tell her that, you know, like I wanted to photograph this woman without a head, and then she says that why would anyone want to do that? And anyway, he has a strange accent, it seems. So it's this thing of it's a hint that I want to leave behind, that I'm also an outsider as an edit photographer in that space. And in the story, in the 12th story, in the first story, he comes through Chennai, but in a different place in Tamil Nadu. And in the last story, comes from Chennai. So it's also these little sort of triggers, you know, because we also have today a lot of outsider politics. And I think there's been a very big problem in India where people from North India have always kind of tried to put the dominance on other parts of India. And in fact, other parts of India can be far more literate. And, you know, in a way, like, they're in a far better place than, for example, people from Delhi. And yet there is this sort of a tension of region also that exists. And North India kind of is like, has its own problems, you know. And I think I wanted to, with the story, also acknowledge my presence as an outsider. And this element of an outsider has become something that I've become very, it's become an important element across many of my newer works, you know. So even if I'm working in Kashmir, I'm going there as an Indian. So for me, this identity of an Indian, and I'm someone who doesn't really care about nationality, but that's the only work where I'm taking on the identity of an Indian, because that has a very different meaning, you know. When I was there, people would tell me that I'm Kashmiri, you're Indian. And yet in India is always trying to stake claim on Kashmir, you know. So so for me, that was also very important to put out, saying that I'm an outsider in that place. And similarly, even for The Lost Head and the Bird, because there's also this element of sensationalism that I'm playing with, which very often an outsider kind of brings in with that limited perspective, or even to manipulate a certain perspective. And so those are the kind of fine lines that I'm trying to play with, and in a way also question the politics of image making in that sense.
I was also wondering, because there are some images of you, like the lost head woman, and also these two images which are next to each other, which we just saw. But towards the end of your film, there are also found footage, right?
Yeah, so...
And I wondered if, because for me, it's not in my, I hardly can recognize things you show there. But maybe for your context, for people who are maybe living in Delhi or in Chennai or something, they recognize all the things, the little pieces you collect together. Is it like an iconic way you show, or are these bits that you really can't put to a specific situation when you see them?
Well, it's a mix of things. I think it has a lot of random stuff in it. It has a lot of at the same time, it has a lot of events of violence that kind of became news in the nation. I'd ended up coincidentally finding a lot of this material before it became news, because at that time I was very actively finding, not necessarily in the dark web, but very accessible places. But these were spaces that the mainstream wasn't really looking at that moment. And at the same time,
can you specify that moment? Because over what period of time did you produce this?
I think this was a little after the government came to power. I think 2015 is when maybe the first, I might be wrong, but I think the first event that really became big news all across India was these 3 Dalit men being beaten, tied to, I think they were behind the truck, and that video is there because they were skinning a carcass of a cow, a cow carcass. And they were beaten by high caste people. And that was the first one that really sort of, I think, became big news. But these things have been happening for a while, it's just that now when these events take place, people also recording many of these events, also in a way to kind of, I think their relationship to their own images is almost like having a trophy for what they've done. It's also to kind of show off in their own sort of ecosystem. But when it kind of spills out of their sort of ecosystem, it becomes news of a different kind. It's a complicated world. At the same time, I'm also in it in a way where there's a lot of videos that I had been influenced by when I was a kid growing up. So there is, I've linked some of them in my website, a few of them. There's this link to Ek Chidiya, Anek Chidiya, which is like the first animation made in India. It seems really sweet and everything, but it's about unity in strength. And then later on, I kind of thought, like, for me, it was a bit weird because India also has a very, not a very, I mean, the history is quite complicated because a lot of people, I mean, it was built by force. Many of the states were forced to come together. That's the legacy of independence in some ways. And there was that. There is, Ramayan that I used to kind of watch as a kid with my grandparents every Sunday morning. And that's something, even today during the lockdown, that's been, the government's kind of broadcasting it through their television channel again. There is this film called Jaane Bhi Do Yaaro, which I really love. It's a satire. It's a satirical comedy. And I think maybe some of the people, if they're from India, they might some of them might have watched it already. There's also, for example, the Babi Masjid demolition that took place in 1991. There are certain bombings in Bombay that had happened. These are also kind of events that were shaping me, the Kargil War. When I was growing up in my early teenage years, or, just before I was reaching my teenage years. And I feel like it took a really long time for me to, sort of pull that influence apart and kind of get a sense of it. I think I've lost you. I mean, am I still online or?
You're still online.
Yes.
Okay.
I can clearly hear you. And is this also because you just described that it's a very subjective way you collected this material and put it together, and in the end you write all the sources down like it's handwritten. Is it also a hint that it's your selection? So why did you do it? Why did you write it?
I mean, yes, in a way, but at the same time, I think that's also got more to do with my method, because somehow I end up writing a lot with my work, and I like the idea of making mistakes while writing, because it also gives it's a sort of a gesture that maybe might also show my thought process at that moment. Maybe I've written something, I've cut it out and I found another word. If someone wants to kind of read into it, that space is there. I don't want to give something too perfect and well done, but in a way, like when I'm working with this material, when I'm doing a lot of my work, I'm also working with a lot of doubt because I'm not sure. I'm trying to find my footing, and I think I'll also be making a lot of mistakes along the way. And I think, yeah, I kind of, I'm quite comfortable to kind of put that part out, this whole idea of navigating through my own process. And somehow writing by my hand, I feel reveals a little more than typing it out. But in the end, whatever is typed out, that's the more important stuff, this context. It's in a way for me also a bait to kind of leave for someone to perhaps want to watch the video again, because maybe after knowing the context, some of the context, the relationship with the video changes. They might anticipate some of the things that might be coming. They might see some things that they hadn't noticed before. Some things that seemed violent before might actually seem a little funny now. So I'm also interested in this idea of a relook. Because I feel like the world that we are living in, which is bombarding us with really a huge amount of information relentlessly, is not really giving us a space to really make sense of what is happening. By the time we make sense of it, the world has already moved on. But this element for relook for me, I think, is something that is needed. And it also kind of is about maybe trying to make people realize that the moment you get context, how does it really shift the way you're looking. The video that is playing, or that was playing in the museum, it's a video in loop, but the loop variates into something else, keeps morphing into something else, because that's what I was saying, that even though you have a relook, by the time you get back to it, the world has moved on. So in a way, like, you might look back at the same video, but the video is never quite the same again. So those are the kind of elements that I've kind of got to on a step-by-step process.
And you described quite well in which kind of context and you produced the film and the images. And now it's shown here in Germany in the Photo Biennial in a completely different context. At the time of the opening, you were here, and have you had a feeling that this makes also something different to your video work, or can it then maybe seen in a different way, or is it just the same?
Well, I think for me, it's not so much to actually really, it's not so much about showing in Germany, because I've shown it in Germany before in film festivals and video festivals. I think it's more to do with the time, because this was something I was working on constantly, from 2016. It was always evolving into something else. But by end of 2019, with all the violence and, the government-backed pogrom that was taking place, I think the real world became far more absurd and extreme than the video itself. So in a way, like, by the time I had reached Germany, I was also in a very strange space, because I'd come straight from Delhi, which had seen a lot of violence, and to kind of come to Germany and look at the video and talk about it. I was also in a bit of a, the video to me didn't really make that much sense anymore, because when I started making it, for me, it was something I could see where we were heading. And by the time, I came for the festival, I think reality had bypassed the video, like, by miles. And in a way, like, the video felt so much more tame and held together and less absurd than what's happening around us currently. So my relationship changed more to do with time rather than where it's really being shown.
Yeah, interesting, right? And also you talked about this distinction or difference, hierarchy between the, say, amateur photography, hobby photographers, and the other side of, say, formerly artistic photography or professional photography. And normally kind of like the artistic and professional photography is kind of had been seen as more real in a way, or better than the other ones, and you're kind of swapping those, or kind of suggesting that the other one become more real than the first one. So is this something you just suggesting in the video, in the artwork, or is this a general feeling where we would say like this is a general change?
No. For me, honestly, in the end, it's all about the context. I think when I say that the real world is out there and not so much here, is more that at least in the beginning, when a lot of these images are being made, they're being made with, I might be wrong, but I feel that they're being made with a less baggage of an agenda, so it's less unfiltered in some ways, even though it might be uglier in some ways, but that ugliness also becomes beautiful in a way. I mean, a lot of my images the vocabulary that I've chosen for this is actually quite influenced by the images out there, which are without these filters. And for me, by the end of it, what's more real or less depends a lot on the context with which you're playing with it. It's just that I think I've realized more and more that the so-called artistic practice within photography is a very small bubble, whereas early on it might have been the mainstream, but today the mainstream lies elsewhere, and it's also to do with the vocabulary that's existing, sort of way of communicating that's existing. I mean, Instagram, Facebook, whatever, they've got their own vocabularies going on, and their audiences are far bigger than, what some people who are working in a more formal space have. And there's a reason, because there are certain shifts that are taking place. By that, I don't mean one is better than the other. It's just a sort of an acknowledgement of a shift in a balance, and I feel like for me, this is something general, that for me to really exist as someone who's still working with images, I really have to give respect to the larger part and not dismiss it, like many of us actually sometimes do. But of course, the context matters in terms of photojournalism and all of those things. Obviously, it's a thing of context, having trust in a certain context, and in a way, when you know where the source is, it kind of gives you that trust, whereas some of these viral images, very often you don't know where the source really lies, and there's less accountability as well. So it's a give and take in both. So I'm not saying one is better than the other. It's just I have to know what purpose each one has. Just that.
So there's still a future for the single image in a way, or the...
Yeah. I mean, I think everything has, for me, I look at everything in waves, and everything is in cycles, and it's about a balance. And I feel that, the moment, and I mean, today, for example, there was one time a few years ago, everyone was talking about citizen journalism. But today, everyone's trying to find what they can trust. And it's sometimes not citizen journalism. But at the same time, you do have people depending on a lot of these images made by the public, in certain spaces where journalists might not be going. So I think we're in a space where the blacks and whites have really kind of disappeared, and we're living in so many grays that we have to kind of navigate through each shade of gray on its own, at its own, level. I can't say anything absolute for any of these things ever again now.
And completely different question, but have you had a chance to see also the other artworks in the biennial at the opening, or?
Well, I mean, I had a look at, for example, Max, because Max is a friend of mine, and Dries de Potter as well. There's certain photographers who are obviously challenging the notion of fiction within photography. I thought the Walker Evans show was quite rich. And I think what I really appreciated about the walkthrough was the anecdotal part of it, which David was kind of, which David was putting forward. It kind of made you look at the whole show with a lot more empathy in some ways. I was really happy to see. I might you'll have to kind of give me the names. Uta Mahler.
Ute und Jana Mahler.
Yeah. So the two of them, I'd already, I think the agency called Oskrutz in Berlin.
Oskrutz.
So
yes.
they were looking at they had a lot of these archives of East German photographers. So for me, that was really interesting, and it was amazing to see those photographs. There's a certain sensibility that one also has a certain stereotype of Swiss German photography, and that was just so different, and it was beautiful to look at. I think obviously people like Vanessa Winship, they're people whose works I've admired for a long time, and George Giorgio's large scale photographs, of people in the rallies. I think the size of it makes it so much more different to actually experience it on just images on the web or even a book, because in those large scale productions, which were whatever 6, 7, 8 feet wide, you get to actually notice the faces a lot more, and I think the faces make a big difference in those works, because faces in the crowds, as well as the different socioeconomic brackets within the crowd, how they're separated or not, or some places are mixed. So I think in a way these are things that I might have missed out on if I was just looking at that work, for example, on the web, as opposed to looking at it in the show, because I also realized that as a reader of images, I'm living in a fast-paced world, and it takes a lot for me to kind of be slowed down to be able to read more into images. I feel like I'm also growing kind of impatient as a consumer, which is horrible. But in a space like that, I felt that particular work stopped me in quite an effective way because of the size, because you can go back and you can kind of go forward and look at all the elements in more detail, which might not have happened in a different way. So there were these different elements, which were kind of quite nice to look at.
So you really make advertisement for us all going to museums to slow down and to properly look at images.
Yeah, I mean, as much as I might crib about formal spaces at times, because sometimes it feels so slow, and I'm always in a hurry, and but when I notice myself as a reader of images, that's when I realize the sort of need for time, and I think that the world today has slowed down so much that I think people are realizing, when I talk to people from privilege, I would add that, but who can afford to say that, this is actually good for us, this stopping, it was too fast paced. So, I mean, it's a privilege, but it's something that I sense a lot of people feel like they've needed, because we were all kind of going crazy before this, and we still are, but I think this element of time and actually discovering things, like I'm here on my rooftop. I actually don't know if my video is working at all, but I come on my rooftop every day, and it's my only thing. It's my anchor. Oh wow!
Yes. I quickly show it to everyone. So this is in the Süddeutsche Zeitung magazine today, because there are 20 famous worldwide photographers who shared their image of the Corona crisis. And this is from Sohrab Hura. So show us
Those are the neighbors.
Yes,
Those are the people.
neighbors.
That's the rooftop. Yeah.
That's the rooftop.
So, yeah. So you know, like, I mean,
today.
so this is a luxury of time that only some of us can kind of experience, but it's slowing down, you know, and I think even going to museums is luxury for some of us, you know, at least in our part of the world.
Mm.
Sohrab, sorry, René,
yeah, sure.
go ahead. Yeah, I'm curious to ask you something. Of course, I saw this work, you know, in Germany, and again before today's tour. What I want to understand is, has Madhu had a chance to experience what you created?
No,
And
I lost Madhu. Madhu was someone. Sorry.
right. And my actual question there is that how important is it as a photographer or an artist to kind of also make your subject understand what goes on in your head? I mean, you are the outsider. You are making a body of work with them in it. And there are various contexts that we are talking about. And we also understand that the context is extremely important. The whole relooking that you were talking about, you know, and to an average person outside, maybe if they saw this work the first time itself without all the context, they might think of it as very artistic and, you know, exploratory, sensational to a certain extent. And then we talk about what's going on in the country, the caste system, so many things, you know. And don't you think it is our as artists, as photographers, somewhere we are also accountable to the people on whom we make the work? Or what are your thoughts? I'm just curious to know.
No,
that.
that's why I brought in the aged photographer who's part of it, you know, because I had my first encounter with this problem in 2005, 2006, when I was you know, working on Narega, which is this is like an act that kind of guarantees every household 100 days of employment in rural India. And I'd studied economics. I'd gone with this professor of mine, Jean Rez, on this Rozgar Adhikar Yatra, and then I continued to work on employment and livelihood issues over there. And of course, you know, you realize that people really are very generous with opening up their lives, and then you're taking from there. And you also, in many ways, in some situations, telling people that actually, and these are people whose lives are in very dire, you know, situations. You're telling them that, you know, whatever I'm doing is not really going to affect you at all, because very often people have expectations that someone has come from the city, my story is going to go out, and then you kind of end up giving them a reality check, a very cruel reality check that is not going to really affect anything. And yet people are quite generous, you know. So in a way, I feel like as photographers, we are constantly taking, and then I couldn't deal with it anymore, and I actually started photographing my mother, because I was also getting very aware of this hypocrisy of always photographing the other and not yourself in some ways, you know. And that's when I realized my own vulnerability. Someone's going to look at my mom, someone's going to judge my mother for looking the way she is, and I felt so vulnerable. So in a way, I also started to look inwards. I felt I wanted to earn my right to look outwards. That is something that happened ages ago, and in some ways I kind of resolved, not really, it's not resolved at all, but I've accepted that this is an inherent problem, or it's this hierarchy, you know, between the person being photographed and the person making the image. And what I realized was, I mean, Madhu saw the images that I was making. Madhu was quite happy with many of them. Madhu was playing around, and I don't know if Jaising and Satish and all are there, because these are also people who help me. So it's not just the photographer, but very often we owe so much of our works to many people who actually help us, who never really get acknowledged. So the situation within which I've been photographing, I have to be responsible for it as much as I can. But what I also realized was that, like, I sometimes feel like we always talk about collaboration quite easily. But very often I feel that there is no real collaboration, and I think I feel, because in the end, I'm the one who's making decisions on how this work gets used. Because if I'm talking about meanings being imputed onto images, it's not just at the point of making the images, it's also how it's shown, where it's shown.
Absolutely.
And, in a way, I met Madhu in a situation where the only thing I could do was tell Madhu what I was doing and explain whatever I could. And Madhu was curious to see my photographs. Madhu liked the photographs. Madhu seemed to be okay with my presence. Those are things that I could account for that time, but I can never claim for the work to be collaborative in any way. It's because at each step I have to take responsibility for it, because I'm constantly tinkering with the meaning of the image. There are some people who are in the photographs, because there's a lot of theater in the images as well. So a lot of the photographs that might feel a little discomforting, maybe some of them are theater. I mean, maybe not. I don't want to reveal everything, but in a way, like, some of those people have seen, and those are also people who are doing certain things where they're looking at violence in their own sort of mediums. So
I think the explanation already touched this question a bit, but maybe you can answer it a bit, because we have one question from the audience. And it's about the editing process. So how does your experience from editing the short story and editing the film, how do they, how would you describe it?
How different was it, basically?
They're completely different. For me, I think I always wanted both of them to be able to exist independently. It's just so that I want to put them together, but I don't want one to die without the other. In terms of the editing, I mean, I have to speak about this day after as well, so it's good for me to practice. Like in this particular work, I think it was I mean, I don't know how to explain why I kind of chose one with the other. It was a lot of triggers that I was looking at in this case, because you have one image on the left side that changes, and it changes the meaning of the other. There are certain sort of triggers, There's an image, for example, of Kanhaiya, who like, I went with Soham, kind of met Kanhaiya and his mum, and they were telling us about their story, and they were saying that he's from a lower middle class family, but he still goes out to beg because he can get some money, and also people on certain, like his mum was saying that people in certain situations, certain events and all, really worship him, and other events they kind of ignore him, or he's treated as an outcast in some ways, and that has been juxtaposed with, for example, a religious sort of a thing, whether it's Ganesh or something else, that is also kind of juxtaposed with something else, so which could be religious or not. I mean, I have to see, because all 12 versions have different juxtapositions, but there are these sort of little interconnectedness that I'm looking at in this work. In some of the other works, these interconnected images are there only in between a few images, so this is one work where every image I'm trying to kind of cut out the hierarchy and actually look at the logic with which I'm moving forward. The editing of this and the book, The Coast, is different, because in The Coast, In the end, the work kind of moves into the sea. So the editing kind of is in a way where it starts to kind of take you outwards towards a different landscape. Whereas in this, by the end of it, it does not really matter. You know, like the 12 versions, all the edits are mixed up because for me, there was no one clear linear narrative. What really mattered were these micro narratives that were taking place. I don't know if that kind of answers your question, because if I look at Life is Elsewhere, if I look at Look It's Getting Sunny Outside, there is a larger narrative in place. In this particular work, The Lost Head and the Bird, I have like a starting point, and then it starts to lose itself, you know, because the larger narrative doesn't really matter anymore, which is why it also starts to pick up pace, because for me, the whole thing of it starting to spiral and pick up pace is also about images actually ceasing to matter, because as I was saying, I'm actually going into a world that feels a lot more real, which is this outside, you know, the appropriated imagery, the found images. And in a way, I'm using my images more as a bait for you to enter this real space that you might not have entered otherwise. I hope it answers your question in some way, and I'm sorry if I've not really been too clear, whoever asked this question.
Right. Thank you, Sohrab. I'm going to take on another question that has come in for you. What was the intention behind the found imagery or footage that you chose for the film? Why did you edit in or out these particular found images and video? From Karen Dias.
Hi, Karen. How are you? I think I look at the video as me really vomiting my head out. And the vomit is not so much to do with my own images. I mean, that's part of it. But the vomit is actually a lot to do with everything that I'm consuming every day. Even today, if I'm looking online and I'm seeing, like, I don't know if you're experiencing the same as me, but there's so much noise everywhere. You know, it's a visual noise out there, and you can see different sort of push and pulls within these spaces, you know, which are trying to dominate, which are trying to kind of influence you. And sometimes it's exhausting, and sometimes I'm losing sense. And that is the real work for me. So, I mean, in a way, I would turn the question around and say, why did I actually include my images? And I could then answer saying that I needed to bring in my images because the idea was to use it as bait, because the real part of the work was, you know, this larger part where I wanted to lead someone into, you know, and kind of break down that hierarchy between what I was doing. And because I also started to realize that I wasn't able to, I could only manage a photo story with my own photos, you know. I could manage a photo book, but the photo book also becomes a different thing. And the book that I made, The Coast, even though it kind of has a similar trunk of a tree, but the branches where the Lost Head branches out and where the coast branches out are very different, you know. And the coast for me becomes a far more I would say it's less pessimistic. It's not optimistic, but it's less pessimistic in a way. There is some space for hope. So the sea becomes this element where the washing away, because there's a lot of masquerading in the photographs that I made. And also this idea of the masquerade or the mask is also very important to me in different works, even in Kashmir. Kashmir is to do with my own mask of denial, being an Indian. And in terms of the coast, it's to do with the masks that people wear, and they behave in a certain way. And in 2014, when there's a big Modi wave, there were a lot of these Modi masks everywhere, you know. So I see a lot of this element of masks kind of coming out, and you kind of see how after the 2019 elections, people who might have postured to be liberal, secular, whatever you want to call them, today have no qualms about, you know, taking certain political positions that seem quite problematic, you know. So in a way, I feel like a lot of these masks are also slipping off people. But the book, The Coast, it's more about the sea becomes a far bigger, far stronger entity than all of us, and that kind of gives some hope. Like we are trying to battle the sea, and I've also made a movie called The Coast, which I was supposed to show at the Liverpool Biennial, which is connected to the film and the book. Maybe I'll put out a small segment of it somewhere, but that also looks at this element of the work, which is the washing part. So that's why I kind of brought in the found images, because it's a different sort of reality that I want to kind of take you into. What I'm doing with my own work is more a suggestive reality, I feel, in comparison.
So I think you've partially answered our next question. There's somebody called Dib Studios who's asking this. Why the coast? Why is it important to you? What links you to this story? With or without photography, would you take the same risks or be in that position?
So to begin with the photography bit, I think I would not take the same risk. I think in general, I'm a person who can get quite scared. I'm a person who can get quite shy. And very often photography becomes an excuse for me to experience certain things and kind of experience the world in a certain way that I might not have otherwise. And I don't think I would have experienced the same, as I have. In terms of why the coast, I would go back. I don't do many assignments, but one of the very early assignments, 2007 or something, that I'd done, I actually was working with an organization called Tourism Concern, where they were looking at sustainable tourism, and we were working along the East Coast Road and some parts of Kerala. And in the course of that, it also was. It's surprising. I mean, it's not surprising, but it's surprising how shocked I was at that time that I realized how much pedophilia, for example, was in these so-called serene coastal holiday spots, which I'd never really thought about before, and there's a lot of human trafficking taking place there. There were a lot of these other sort of elements that were a lot darker than what these areas try and be. And then later on also kind of started to realize that these areas, the regions, the coastline, as someone coming in from the inside, the landlocked part, these spaces were always, a sort of a space for breathing for me. They were always the calmer spaces. It's only that they actually were not that calm. But coming from a landlocked region within the country, I started to look at, this notion of pushing outwards into this open space, which was the sea. So the coastline for me became a sort of a physical landscape that I ended up using as a method to kind of look at something more psychological within that landscape. So the coast for me becomes a sort of an edge, it's a sort of a tipping point where, like in the book, the coast, there's a sort of a frenzy that is happening on land, and then there's a bit of a relief within the sea. I feel bad because I might end up saying the same things day after. So if anyone's listening day after, please, you can switch off and watch something else. So that was the metaphor that I ended up using the coast as. And of course, I could have actually looked at anything else as to kind of enter maybe a similar space or allude to something similar. But the way I work, I'm always looking at something that has my own connection, my own experience. And, I have to, in the end, be able to take responsibility for what I'm doing and the position that I'm taking. So I didn't go to Kashmir because I wanted to do a work on Kashmir. I went there because I went there on holiday. And after going there on holiday, I kind of realized that it felt really weird because I was only in Gulmarg. And then that made me want to actually go back to see a part of Kashmir that I'd missed out on. And similarly with the coast, because I would always go on these holidays. I would always kind of want to go there because it made me feel more free, and it was kind of made me feel something. But then at the same time, there were these other elements that I could not ignore, so because of these personal experiences, I ended up looking at the coast, but I could have looked at anything else. It's just that my method is to kind of look at something that I am able to kind of account for, and not necessarily give like this large sort of a position saying this is it.
We have another, sorry, Yasmin?
We run out of time. So maybe this is the last question because we are already over our time.
Okay.
But yes, maybe the last question.
Okay, so Abhijit asks that when somebody is revisiting the film after seeing the information about the found footage, does the context of your images change or evolve into something else?
Well, I think that's for Abhijit to tell me. I'm hoping that happens. And from whatever tests that I've done, test runs I've done, where people actually sat and watched maybe 2 or 3 times, they experience different things. But that was also an early version that is basically on the website at the moment, which is this 10-minute piece. But there's a different installation version that I have where the video is on loop, but each loop kind of changes. So even if you want to kind of stay back and watch, I'm trying to create that element of doubt even more, whether it's the same film or not, So in the beginning, obviously, I was looking in terms of one film, one piece, and this element of the context, would have had a very direct impact on the perception of the film getting affected. But now the actual film starts to morph into something else slowly. And I'm trying to do it in a way where you are not quite sure what the change is, but it feels a little different. There might be in the barrage of images, one image might pop out that you didn't see. Like what you're seeing here is version number 1, but version number 3 could be more violent. Version number 4 actually goes back into the history of politics, goes into independence, goes into the emergency period. Version number 6 could actually go in a very absurd way. There are also 2 versions within it where I've accelerated the pace of the frenzy 10,000 times. So if you watch that extremely accelerated version, and then you watch this normal version ends up feeling a bit slow, so your reading of it is different. So in each subsequent reading, I'm trying to affect the perception, in a certain way. So it's not only the context actually, but a lot of these other sort of maneuvers that I'm trying to kind of manipulate how you might receive the film. Because I feel like this, like we were talking just before this about slowing down, which is something I'm also trying to bring in the film piece, in the installation piece, where those two versions really, you can't make anything out because it's 10,000 times images are kind of hitting you, on the pace. And then what you watch, like today, after looking at so often, this work on my website feels really slow, because I recognize everything. So the more you recognize as well, it's also about familiarity. I think even today, the way we are receiving information, it's about shock. What shocks you? Something new might shock you. But I don't know if you were there in the beginning where even during our tests, when I was talking to the panelists over here, I was saying that in the beginning, when these lynchings were happening in 2015, it was feeling like a shock. But today, somehow, the shock has worn off because now it's become something else. So those are all the things that I hope end up affecting your reading of it. But in the end, you'll be the one who will be able to say whether I'm bullshitting or it's actually just the same, or I think that's your answer to give me, actually.
Thank you, Sohrab. I mean, of course, there are always going to be more and more questions and more to discuss. Thank you, René, for being with us, and Yasmin for really making this happen. I think over these last few weeks, of course, we had the good fortune to visit the shows, but this is a very interesting way to also tune in to spaces where we might not be able to do so otherwise. And we hope to keep this conversation going in various other formats. I've requested my colleague to share the link of the Biennale for Actual Photography so that all of you can go and revisit the shows and spend more time, slow down, spend more time with the shows and know more about the artists. Thank you so much for being with us, everyone.
And the link is there for people to see over the next 2
yes.
days on my website.
Work is there on his website. Feel free, it's there until the weekend, so you can go and have a relook and form your own opinions about the work. And thank you so much. Stay connected with us at Chennai Photo Biennale. We will constantly have more programming coming up, given that all of us are probably going to be at home for another month or more, definitely. So thank you. Thank you, everyone. It's been great, Yasmin.
Well, thank you for having me.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sohrab, and thank you, René, so much.
And
Bye-bye.
thank you. And now my neighbor has also come out to do his gymming and all the parties started. So I don't know if you can see.
Again.
Right on time. He's come out a little late today.
Wonderful. Thank you, Sohrab,
I keep
so
sending
much.
him photographs. Take care.
Sure.
Bye.
Thank you. Good luck.
Bye. Thanks.
Bye-bye. Stay safe, everyone. Bye.
Bye.